while the world obsessively monitors simmering geopolitical flashpoints. A silent, deliberate mutiny is systematically crippling the United States military from the inside out, a phenomenon unmistakably highlighted by the catastrophic, exceptionally timely fires aboard the Uss Eisenhower. But what happens when the very service members tasked with upholding a sprawling global empire decide they would rather secretly incapacitate their own multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers and deliberately cannibalize their own fighter jets than be deployed into another endless, unwinnable conflict? Are we witnessing the inevitable collapse of an overextended superpower, not at the hands of a formidable external competitor, but through the profound, crushing exhaustion of its own disillusioned youth? I am Sophia Bennett, and welcome back to Sophia Bennett Reports. Today, we are bypassing the sanitized press briefings of the Pentagon to uncover a chilling reality. The calculated, internal sabotage within the armed forces is not merely a string of isolated maintenance accidents, but a desperate, systemic bid for survival by a military apparatus fractured by the weight of its own unyielding hegemony. Indeed, Eisenhower limped back into port for what was officially slated as a routine maintenance cycle. The geopolitical expectation was clear: a swift refit, a rapid turnaround, and a prompt return to the volatile theater of global power projection by the latter half of the following year. Yet, a strange phenomenon began to unfold within the heavily guarded confines of the shipyard. Mysterious fires broke out, undocumented structural anomalies were suddenly discovered, and the timeline for redeployment quietly but drastically lengthened. To the untrained eye, this might appear as a string of unfortunate logistical hiccups. But for those analyzing the mechanics of hegemony from a macro perspective, it reveals a profound and unspoken strategy. When the prospect of returning to an increasingly lethal geopolitical environment looms, a burning wire or a flooded compartment is no longer a tragic accident. It is a meticulously crafted insurance policy against oblivion. To understand the gravity of this silent rebellion, one must look at the agonizing mass of imperial overstretch. The United States operates a fleet of immensely complex, nuclear-powered leviathans, each costing billions to build and millions daily to keep afloat. The Eisenhower itself is a relic of a bygone era, commissioned decades ago and rapidly approaching its 50th year of service by 2027. Pushing an aging warship beyond its operational limits requires a crew willing to endure the crushing psychological and physical toll of relentless back. Its decline was marked, not immediately, by catastrophic defeats at sea, but by magnificent dreadnoughts, indefinitely confined to dry docks. The maintenance yards transformed into the final resting places for imperial ambition. Today, A similar paralysis infects the American military apparatus. It is not merely a lack of technological capability, but a profound evaporation of human willingness. The strategic calculus of the ordinary sailor is ruthlessly pragmatic, operating entirely within the ironclad safety regulations of the military itself. If a vessel is tentatively scheduled to be decommissioned by 2029, stretching a complicated overhaul into a multi-year bureaucratic odyssey is a surprisingly simple endeavor. Modern naval safety protocols dictate that a ship cannot deploy if critical systems fail inspection. By strictly, almost maliciously, adhering to these protocols and allowing accidental damage to fester, the crew legally binds the hands of their commanders. The labyrinthine nature of defense procurement and the notorious systemic delays of maritime contractors provide the perfect, impenetrable cover. A minor mechanical failure is magnified into a systemic crisis that demands endless reviews and part requisitions. The shipyard, traditionally a place of repair, transforms into a bureaucratic sanctuary. For the exhausted crew, the logic is flawless. If the carrier remains in pieces on the dock, it cannot be deployed to the perilous, missile-laden front lines of the modern geopolitical chessboard. The men and women aboard secure their physical safety, not by deserting their posts, but by ensuring their designated platform of war is thoroughly, legally, and undeniably incapacitated. They are successfully outmaneuvering their own government's foreign policy without ever firing a single shot. The mighty aircraft carrier, once the ultimate symbol of unchallengeable global power projection, is quietly being dismantled from within by the very hands trained to operate it. It is akin to a medieval knight deliberately rusting his own armor, so he cannot be summoned to a crusade he no longer believes in. The true vulnerability of a sprawling superpower is rarely exposed by the weapons of a foreign adversary. It is laid bare when its own defenders weaponize bureaucracy and mechanical failure to survive. Ultimately, a warship delayed in dry dock for a decade is not a maintenance failure. It is a successful, bloodless mutiny masquerading as logistical incompetence. Furthermore, while the sheer scale of a delayed carrier overhaul captures headlines, the true art of this institutional evasion is practiced at the microscopic level, deep within the labyrinthine bowels of the active fleet. How exactly does a crew legally incapacitate a billion-dollar warship without facing a severe court? Marshall, the answer lies in the asymmetric tactics of internal sabotage, specifically targeting the highly sensitive logistical arteries of these vessels. In the modern era of naval warfare, fleets are heavily reliant on complex, at-sea supply chains. When the standard evasion tactic of simply missing the boat or hiding during port calls becomes untenable, especially when modern logistics vessels are designed to resupply carriers directly on the open ocean. Denying sailors the refuge of a friendly harbor, the crew must get creative. They smoothly pivot from passive avoidance to active, untraceable disruption. Destroying the weapons systems outright is far too risky. It invites immediate high-level military investigations and places the saboteur in direct peril of being charged with treason, while simultaneously leaving the ship defenseless. Instead, the focus brilliantly, yet devastatingly, shifts to the propulsion and fluid management systems. A modern nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, accompanied by its sprawling strike group, costs upwards of $8 to $10 million every single day to operate. Yet, this astronomically expensive armada can be brought to its knees by the simplest of physical realities, the basic incompatibility of oil and water. Across the sprawling, multi-level engine rooms of these titans, thousands of miles of pipes intertwine in a dizzying, lightless maze. It is practically impossible for naval commanders to maintain continuous surveillance over every inch of this plumbing. The tactic is chillingly simple and remarkably effective. Intentionally cross-wiring or quietly rupturing the boundaries between the water lines and the lubrication systems. A tiny, undocumented fracture that allows water to bleed into the main engine oil, or vice versa, triggers immediate automated safety shutdowns. The magnificent engines, capable of pushing a 100,000-ton floating city across oceans, suddenly grind to a halt to prevent catastrophic permanent mechanical failure. Who is to blame for a burst pipe deep in the bilge? Was it metal fatigue, poor shipyard maintenance, or a deliberate, calculated tap from a wrench? The ambiguity is the ultimate shield. The ship simply loses power and begins to drift. But crucially, drifting at sea does not equate to sinking or dying. The vessel remains structurally sound. The crew is entirely safe, and the defensive weapons arrays can technically still function on auxiliary power, warding off any opportunistic strikes. They are effectively removed from the geopolitical chessboard, transformed into a heavily armed, multi-billion-dollar raft. They simply wait for a tow tug to haul them back to a safe, distant port for emergency repairs. Once docked, the bureaucratic nightmare begins anew, adding months to the repair schedule as contractors argue over liability and parts procurement. This strategy naturally extends to the aviation wings. Contaminating the highly refined aviation fuel with a seemingly innocent, untraceable impurity ensures that the multi-million-dollar fighter jets are firmly grounded. By saving the aircraft from flying, the mechanics simultaneously save the pilots from deploying, effectively shutting down the primary offensive capability of the carrier strike group in one synchronized, unspoken motion. The mightiest leviathans of the sea, designed to project dominance across entire hemispheres, are being paralyzed not by hypersonic missiles or stealth torpedoes, but by a microscopic, deliberate drop of water in an oil line. It exposes a profound vulnerability within the architecture of hegemony. Absolute technological supremacy crumbles into ocean debris the moment the human operators decide they would rather float harmlessly than fight a war they do not want. Yet this phenomenon is not confined to the ocean. The paralysis gripping the maritime fleet is mirrored with eerie precision in the skies. For the aviation branches, the method of evasion requires a different kind of mechanical ingenuity, one that exploits the staggering complexity of modern aerial warfare. Traditionally, when a military squadron faces severe supply chain bottlenecks, maintenance crews engage in a practice known as cannibalization, stripping functional parts from a permanently grounded aircraft to keep another one flying. It is a desperate yet standard measure to maintain combat readiness. However, what we are witnessing now is a brilliant, entirely inverted phenomenon: reverse cannibalization. Imagine the sprawling, Imagine the sprawling to a stealth program whose lifetime cost is projected to exceed an unfathomable $2 trillion. It is heralded globally as the absolute apex of aerospace engineering. Yet, a modern stealth fighter is an incredibly fragile ecosystem of software and sensors, requiring meticulous, constant maintenance to simply leave the runway. If a mechanic deeply aware of the impending geopolitical storms wishes to keep their pilots safely on the tarmac, they do not need to violently smash the avionics. Instead, they systematically take known defective components, a glitching radar module, a compromised hydraulic valve, and quietly install them into fully operational jets. This microscopic, deliberate sabotage creates a cascading wave of failure across the entire fleet. When the High Command urgently demands an operational readiness report, asking how many strike fighters are cleared for immediate deployment to a contested theater, the answer is a statistically verifiable, deeply apologetic 0. The mission simply cannot be ordered, and the pilots are kept safely out of the sky. The sheer brilliance of this tactic lies in its absolute plausible deniability. In a vast procurement system already plagued by genuine logistical nightmares and notorious systemic spare parts shortages, a sudden spike in mechanical failures is practically indistinguishable from the baseline dysfunction of the military-industrial complex. This internal friction is not without stark historical precedent. One only needs to look at the systemic decay of the Soviet military apparatus in the late 1980s. On paper, their arsenals were terrifying, boasting tens of thousands of advanced aircraft and armored vehicles. Yet, in reality, the machinery was rotting from the inside out. The mechanics, the operators, and the frontline troops had entirely lost faith in the grand ideological narrative. They simply went through the motions, signing falsified maintenance logs, and ensuring that the formidable war machine remained nothing more than a hollow, rusting shell. Today, the United States Armed Forces are experiencing a parallel terminal institutional decay. The staggering budget reports flowing from the Pentagon, detailing endless billions poured into fleet readiness, are desperately masking a profound internal refusal to participate in the next global conflict. The ultimate irony of this era is that the most sophisticated aerial armada in human history is being neutralized by the very hands paid to arm it. It is a modern tragedy, written in titanium and aviation fuel. The Imperial Eagles are not being shot from the sky by the hypersonic missiles of a rising geopolitical rival. Rather, they are willfully clipping their own wings in the sterile safety of their hangars, choosing the quiet indignity of a permanently grounded fleet over the fatal roar of an unwinnable war. Rather than relying on mechanical sabotage, the infantryman faces a distinctly different, far more intimate challenge. A ground soldier does not have the luxury of 100,000 platform to disable. When the deployment orders arrive, there is no engine room to flood or radar array to scramble. If an infantryman is told to march into the crucible of combat, they must march. Therefore, to achieve the same crucial objective of remaining far away from the lethal front lines of the next great power conflict, the ground troops must turn inward. If they cannot incapacitate a vehicle, they must legally and administratively incapacitate the only platform they truly control: themselves. We are currently observing a masterclass in psychological and bureaucratic evasion across the ground forces. This is not the loud, fiery defiance of the anti-war movements of the 1960s. Rather, it is a quiet, devastatingly effective epidemic of sudden indisposition. We are seeing a remarkable surge in sudden, profound philosophical awakenings. A soldier, previously cleared for combat, may suddenly discover an intense, unshakable moral or religious conviction that strictly prohibits the taking of human life or the handling of a firearm, initiating the complex, The human mind is a complex, fragile ecosystem, and diagnosing severe, invisible psychological distress, such as acute anxiety or crippling, localized, is heavily reliant on the soldier's own reporting. Once a military medical professional signs that critical piece of paper confirming unfitness for duty, the soldier has successfully erected an impenetrable, legally binding shield against deployment. They are, for all operational purposes, effectively removed from the geopolitical equation. To understand why this is happening on such a systemic scale, we must look at the grim, unforgiving data of the past 2 decades. The United States Army has been hemorrhaging manpower, consistently missing its recruiting targets by tens of thousands of personnel year after year. The youth of today are acutely aware of the devastating legacy left by the post-9/11 forever wars. They look at the harrowing statistics. Over 30,000 active duty personnel and veterans of those conflicts have succumbed to suicide, a number that drastically eclipses actual combat casualties. The modern infantryman is no longer a blindly patriotic instrument of imperial ambition. They have evolved into hyper-rational, geopolitical realists. They have calculated the cost of maintaining a sprawling global hegemony and simply decided that their physical and mental survival is worth far more than the strategic objectives of a distant Pentagon. Even for those who find themselves unavoidably deployed to a forward operating base, the resistance continues through weaponized lethargy. If a squad is pushed into a patrol, the immediate reflex is to call for close air support at the slightest hint of friction. Yet, as we have already explored, those fighter jets are likely grounded by their own mechanics. This creates a perfect circular paralysis. The infantry sits tight, secures a comfortable position, and simply waits. Half a day stalled is half a day survived. Every single hour that can be delayed, dragged out, or tangled in procedural red tape is another hour closer to a safe flight home. It is a profound and melancholy reality. A grand Imperial fortress is not crumbling because enemy siege engines have breached its outer walls. It is collapsing because the very mortar binding the stones together, the raw will of the front-line soldier, has quietly turned to dust. When the fundamental survival instinct of the individual entirely supersedes the institutional mandate to fight, the ultimate battle has already been lost before a single shot is fired. Consequently, when we synthesize these disparate points of friction, the conveniently disabled aircraft carriers, the deliberately grounded stealth fighters, and the meticulously documented psychological evasion of the infantry, a chilling, undeniable macro geopolitical reality emerges. This is not merely a series of isolated disciplinary issues or unfortunate logistical anomalies. It is a synchronized, albeit entirely unspoken, institutional consensus across every branch of the United States Armed Forces, from the deepest oil-stained engine rooms of the naval fleet to the highest echelons of aviation maintenance. A collective decision has been made by the rank and file. They have fundamentally deprioritized the grand, abstract, strategic objectives of global hegemony in favor of a profoundly basic human instinct, the absolute necessity of personal survival and securing a safe return home. But how does this internal paralysis echo across the grand chessboard of global politics? External geopolitical observers and competing powers are certainly not blind to this systemic decay. When intelligence analysts calculate the true operational capacity of the American military, they are no longer simply counting the number of nuclear warheads, fifth-generation bombers, or aircraft carriers listed on public balance sheets. Those impressive figures represent theoretical power, not actual kinetic capability. The modern strategic calculation now critically factors in what we might call a deployment reluctance index, the mathematical probability that a $1 trillion military asset will be inexplicably delayed by a burst pipe. A suddenly faulty radar module or a convenient administrative hurdle, just as a regional crisis escalates. Consider the sheer financial paradox currently at play. The defense budget of the United States is steadily marching toward an astronomical $1 trillion annually, a staggering figure that eclipses the combined military spending of the next several major nations combined. Yet, this unprecedented deluge of capital is yielding drastically diminishing returns in actual deployable combat readiness. The capital is effectively being absorbed by a bureaucratic sponge, funding endless repair cycles, prolonged contractor disputes, and infinite administrative reviews, rather than maintaining a highly motivated fighting force. Competitors understand a fundamental truth. The deterrence factor of a massive military sharply evaporates when adversaries realize that the soldiers operating the machinery are actively looking for legal loopholes to avoid an engagement. They know that forcing a disillusioned, actively resistant military into a high-intensity, peer-to-peer conflict risks a catastrophic collapse of command. This phenomenon forces a complete redefinition of military supremacy in the 21st century. Hegemony is not merely a matter of financial expenditure or technological innovation. It is, at its absolute core, a psychological contract between a government and its military personnel. For decades, that contract was fueled by a potent mixture of ideological certainty and the promise of overwhelming superiority. Today, that contract has been shattered by the staggering cumulative weight of endless, strategically ambiguous deployments that yielded massive casualties and zero tangible victories for the average citizen. The modern service member has clearly read the brutal math of the past 20 years and categorically refuses to be the next expendable variable in a failed equation. Ultimately, the greatest threat to a sprawling, overextended empire is rarely a sudden, overwhelming invasion by a foreign power. Instead, it is the quiet, methodical exhaustion of its own people. We are witnessing the terminal diagnosis of a global policeman. The military apparatus remains, on paper, a colossal, terrifying titan of war. projecting absolute dominance across every continent and ocean. Yet, beneath the polished armor and the staggering budget allocations, the core structure is rapidly rusting from the inside out. It is failing not because it lacks the fuel to run, but because the myriad of vital human gears within the machine have simply and entirely legally decided to stop turning. Ultimately, as we step back and observe this extraordinary phenomenon, these multi-billion-dollar titans of war quietly sidelined by deliberate, untraceable mechanical anomalies, and thousands of troops discovering newfound bureaucratic sanctuaries, a profound geopolitical truth comes into sharp focus. The ultimate vulnerability of any sprawling superpower, regardless of its technological supremacy or astronomical defense budgets, is the undeniable exhaustion of its own people. A state can forge the most devastatingly advanced weapons in human history, but if the very hands tasked with wielding them quietly, systematically refuse to engage, the empire they are meant to defend becomes nothing more than a heavily armed phantom. This silent mutiny is not merely an isolated military crisis. It is a profound historical pivot. We are witnessing the absolute internal limits of hegemony, drawn not by the missile defense systems of rival nations, but by the relentless survival instincts of a deeply disillusioned generation. What are your thoughts on this unprecedented internal friction within the ranks? Do you believe this silent rebellion will fundamentally alter the trajectory of the global geopolitical chessboard? Please drop your insights in the comments below. I always look forward to reading your perspectives. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit that like button to help us bypass the algorithm, and make sure to subscribe to join our growing community of independent observers here at Sophia Bennett Reports. Until next time, stay sharp, stay objective, and always keep questioning the narrative.